Chapter 4 Copenhagen, Denmark, April 5th. Christianborg Palace was cursed. The origins of that curse were shrouded in mystery, but no one doubted that it existed. The massive, rambling configuration stood proud against the night sky. Its core building was a regal, stone, U-shaped structure with a spire stretching up from its center. The palace was the seat of Danish government and parliament, but it was cursed. The location had originally been the site of the castle of Bishop Absalon, built in 1167 and subsequently destroyed. King Christian VI built his palace upon the ruins of Absalon's castle, and it was razed by fire in 1794. Frederick VI built anew upon that spot, but that palace burned to the ground in 1884. The current structure had been completed in 1928, but though the curse went unspoken, the older residents of Copenhagen, in their secret hearts, knew it was only a matter of time. It might have been that the land was tainted. Common wisdom held that it had something to do with Bishop Absalon and his castle, with unspeakable horrors that had been performed there in secret. Others imagined that the clergymen had been righteous and faced the forces of darkness within that castle, and it was they who had laid the curse upon the grounds, and any stone laid upon them. Whatever the truth, there was a sort of energy there, both in the palace above and in the ruins of Absalon's castle below. A dark and ugly energy, resonating with the taint of blood and shadows. Gorm loved it down there, most of the time. Torches burned in sconces on the stone walls, flaring and guttering with each draft and eddy that shuddered through the air of the crumbling ruins. Shattered history lay all around them, chaos meant in some form of order by Gorm's will alone. Tapestries and paintings, jewels and weapons, even contemporary furniture, though the ancient king of Denmark had balked at first at including such modern things in his lair. The others had respectfully pleaded, and eventually he had relented. Still, this was his place. His palace. While the machinery of governing the kingdom of Denmark rumbled along in the modern palace above their heads, Gorm and his followers plotted its destruction, and planned for the time when darkness would reign over the land. For the moment, the hated sun had long since risen, and so Gorm was left only to brood in the stone bowels of Copenhagen, awaiting the night once more. Something moved in the shadows cast by the torchlight. "Who comes?" Gorm demanded. One of his subjects slithered into the light. The vampire's features were scorched, his clothes burnt to the edges, even still smoldering. Gorm frowned and stared at him, hoping for some spark of recognition to ignite in his brain. He had trouble, at times, remembering the names and faces of his subjects. The old king knew he was probably half mad, but madness had never bothered him. Rather, it freed him. "Your name?" the king snapped. The vampire stared at him wide-eyed, then dropped to his knees in obeisance. But you told me never to speak my name in your presence, Majesty." Gorm glowered at the stout creature menacingly. He was a large one, and the king did not like that. Gorm himself was rail-thin, almost a wraith, but savage and fast, and stronger than any who ever dared challenge him. Thus he still lived. But this one... "I don't like the look of you," he snarled. The old king stood from the velvet-shrouded wooden chair that had been his throne for some years, and started across the room toward his subject. "Tell me your name." The stout, charred vampire flinched, eyes to the ground. "Christian, sire." Gorm's eyes went wide, and then he began to laugh. It was an awful sound, even to him, coming up from his guts, churning the air of his fetid breath. Moments after he began, the king stopped laughing. He hated the way it made him feel. "What news, Christian?" Gorm demanded. The vampire remained on his knees. "You sent me to find Ernst, Majesty. He has disappeared." "The Slayer," the king growled. At last Christian looked up and met his sire's gaze. "I think not, Majesty. Others have seen him not long before dawn. He escaped the Slayer, but she must have frightened him, for it seems he has betrayed you." Rage erupted from within Gorm in a roar. His face changed, long fangs jutting from within his mouth. Acid bile burned the back of his throat. "Find him and bring him to me," Gorm snarled, storming back to his throne. He sat, fuming, before he blinked suddenly and looked over at Christian again. "No, to hell with him. Find him and kill him." "But, sire," Christian wheedled, "dawn has come. I nearly burned this morning, bringing this information to you. The sun grows high." "Cover yourself then, fool!" Gorm sat up on his throne, stroking his leathery, pitted face with long, razor talons. "Find Ernst and kill him." Christian stood, bowed deeply, and began to withdraw from the throne room. He moved backward, eyes to the ground. "As you command, sire," the stout vampire said. "Ernst will die." With a wave, Gorm dismissed him, mind already moving on to other matters, specifically the helm of Haxorus. Without it, he might never create the dark kingdom of his dreams. He heard a noise then, like the sound of someone biting into an apple. It was followed by a low grunt of pain. King Gorm knew these sounds all too well. Lips curling back from his teeth, yellow eyes shimmering in the torchlight, he peered at the shadows where Christian had disappeared. A draft blew dust and ash, whipping it into the air and then sweeping it along the stone floor, past the Slayer's boots. She came farther into the room, blonde hair cast with an orange hue by the torches. The girl, Sophie, was tall and lean and moved with extraordinary grace. Gorm admired her for that. He had wanted to drink of her since the first moment he had seen her in front of Grundtvig Church, while it was still under construction. "Slayer," he hissed. A tiny smile played along his sharp teeth, but it did not bother Gorm the way laughter did. There was nothing good in that smile, only pain. "I would not worry about Ernst," she said. "He spoke to the wrong people last night. I missed him once, but I found him again this morning. He is in the wind now." "I am grateful," Gorm sneered. "I suppose I owe you something for disposing of my garbage." The Slayer paused, looked at him, and returned his smile. Gorm shuddered. He did not like that, for her smile seemed even crueler than his own. There were other entrances into the throne room. Already, shadows had begun to cluster in them. Vampires, Gorm's subjects, bringing violent death for she who had dared to intrude upon his presence. With the Slayer disposed of, Gorm knew his quest to find the helm could proceed at a far greater pace. "You've come to die?" the Vampire King asked. "I have come to share information," Sophie replied sharply. "First, I should tell you that I am leaving Copenhagen, perhaps forever." Gorm grunted in surprise. It was not what he had expected to hear. "You will never leave this room alive," he promised her. "You underestimate me," she said, her voice so low that it was almost a whisper. "I am here to kill you, to exterminate all the vermin in this little nest of yours. Before I do that, however, there's something you should know. The helm of Hexerus." The king stiffened. With a flash of teeth and talon, he practically leaped from his throne and crouched on the stone floor, muscles crackling with hatred and violence ready to be unleashed. "What do you know of the helm?" he demanded. "Very little," she said. "But I know this. It isn't here. Not in Copenhagen. Not in Denmark. Nor even in Europe, for that matter." "Tell me where it is!" he shrieked, unable to control himself. The Slayer smiled again. He hated it. Wanted to tear her face off. "Make me," she said. Sophie felt the crackle of evil energy in the ruins. She stood ready, in a stance that Yenna had taught her just after her 10th birthday. There had been years of training even before she had been chosen as the Slayer, and even more intensive instruction since. All for this. "Die!" Gorm snarled, his voice so low and confident that it sounded almost as though he believed he could kill her with just a word. When the ancient king's vampire subjects sprang from the shadows and bolt holes, and from the two other entrances into the throne room, Sophie almost believed it as well, but almost could not kill her. Neither could a word. She had staked 7 vampires as she made her way down to the ruins of Absalon's castle. There were none behind her, but that did not mean she was alone. "Tycho!" she shouted. Her demonic ally let out a war cry his species had not used in 7,000 years of peace. Sophie felt it resonating in her own heart. Then the vampires were upon her. She drew her sword so quickly that it almost felt to her as though she had skipped forward in time. Her blade whisked across the air before her. The room was so filled with vampires that she decapitated 2 of them with that single stroke. She had a stake in her left hand, and she plunged into the chest of a girl she thought she recognized from her youth. A childhood friend, perhaps. Moving on, she forced herself to forget that face. It was not the first of her memories to die, and she had no time to mourn. Tycho's war cry tore through the air again. Sophie drove the point of her sword through the right eye of the vampire in front of her. The blade punched through the beast's brain and out the back of its skull. She cursed herself for having missed the throat and drew the sword out. The vampire was blinded, and she kicked it down in front of several others, buying herself several precious seconds. A quick glance up, and she saw Tycho, the razor spines on his back and arms raised, tearing his way through a rabid pack of vampires. No stake, no sword, no interest in dusting them. He would simply rather tear them apart. Before she looked away, she saw Tycho open his massive jaws impossibly wide, his mouth seeming to unhinge, then clamping shut on the throat of a vampire. His 3 rows of needle teeth chomped cleanly through the thing's neck, and his head fell to the stone ground with a thump before both head and torso exploded in a cloud of dust. Sophie grinned madly. Her stake was knocked from her left hand. She beheaded the vampire that had done it, then cut down another one as she lunged for a torch on the wall. With a roar of her own, the Slayer turned and shoved the burning torch into the gut of the nearest vampire. Its clothes caught fire like kindling, and she kicked the creature back toward 3 others. Their clothes began to burn as well, and they screamed and panicked, trying to put the flames out. Side by side, Sophie and Tycho hacked and slashed and burned their way through the vampires in service to Old King Gorm. Minutes after the bloodshed and death had begun, Sophie held her sword at the ready, barely breathing hard, and watched as two of the creatures turned and ran from her, willing to take their chances in the sun rather than face her. She actually laughed. But she was not the only one. "He was your friend, this one." The voice was Gorm's. Sophie spun, sword in one hand and torch in the other, ready to attack, to do whatever was necessary. But it was too late. Gorm had remained at the edges of the battle. Not so, now. He stood at the center of the room, holding the slumped form of Tycho by the hair. The muscles in the vampire's arm were taut with his power as he held the demon up off the floor with one hand. In the other, Gorm held Tycho's black and bloody heart, trailing thick, torn blood vessels. There was a gaping, ragged wound in Tycho's chest. Sophie whispered her friend's name. "They have two hearts, you know," Gorm said slowly. "Quet's demons." As if to prove the point, Tycho's eyes flared open. "Sophie," he grunted, voice a hoarse ghost of himself. "Watch. I'll show you," the old king snapped. He dropped Tycho's heart into the swirling eddies of vampire dust on the castle floor, then thrust his hand back into the wound, rooting around, snapping bone. Tycho opened his mouth to scream, but could not. He was already dead when his second heart was ripped out through the hole in his chest. Sophie screamed for him and dropped the torch to hold her sword in both hands. Gorm was faster than any vampire she had ever seen. He moved like a snake, his entire body fluid and deadly, built to kill. His long talons swept out to tear Sophie apart. She dodged. Her father's sword impaled him, and Sophie drove him back with all the strength of the Chosen One until Gorm stumbled and sat down hard on his velvet and wood throne. The point of the sword had punched out through his back, and she could hear it splinter the wood of the chair, lodging there, pinning Gorm there. Chest heaving with her fury and grief, Sophie stood away and watched as Gorm cursed and spat, slamming forward, trying to free himself. He had the strength, certainly. It would take seconds. "I will have your blood, girl," he screamed. "I am Gorm! I am king!" Sophie picked up the torch she had dropped and set the throne alight. Gorm screamed and glared at her as the blaze roared up and engulfed his dead flesh in seconds. His wide, insane eyes were fixed on her until they melted in his skull. Gorm exploded in a cloud of burning embers, and the sword that had been her father's clattered to the stone. Sophie picked it up. The metal of the blade was warm from the fire. She said a silent prayer to her father and resheathed the weapon. When Sophie emerged into the sunlight and walked away from Christian Border Palace, her thoughts were of London. She and Yenna would be leaving, possibly that very day, and she would never see that place again. She would miss Copenhagen, but not that place. It was cursed. London, England, May 18th. A pall hung over London, a shroud of dread. Yenna had never seen anything like it. After months of warnings and flag-waving, the invasion and partition of Poland, the buildup of German troops and armaments, the Nazis had invaded Denmark and Norway in April, only days after the Slayer and her watcher had left Copenhagen. The British somehow seemed surprised. There was irony in it. From the day she had arrived in London, she had watched the shifting emotions of the people. They were filled with righteous anger at Hitler and his forces, and yet not overly concerned about the fate of the nations on the continent. Should the Nazis reach their shores, why, the people were cocksure of the supremacy of the British Empire. But the whispers and the shouts had already begun. British industry was not ready. His Majesty's treasury was low on funds and simply could not afford to defend the whole of Europe. But the decision had been made. Despite all the warning signs, there had been almost no preparation for war. The arrogance inherent in that fact was astounding, and yet once into the fray, not a single voice would confess to having been caught napping. None of that mattered. The dread existed, yes, but as a low current running beneath the emotions that surged to the fore. Foremost among them was pride. This was not some new war for the freedom of Europe, but merely a continuation of the Great War begun decades before. Hitler was a new face, but the enemy was the same. The same. But stronger, faster, more brutal. Still, it did not matter. The British Empire would rise to the challenge. Ill-prepared, poorly financed, undersupplied, somehow they would triumph. Every day that passed, Yenna would become more torn between her love and respect for these fierce, courageous people, and her despair that they simply had no idea what they were dealing with. Poland had fallen in 18 days. Norway and Denmark in no more time than that. Here was a conqueror unlike any the modern world had seen, a crisis of unfathomable proportions. Yet somehow, in the building at the far end of Great Russell Street, the Council of Watchers managed to pretend that there were still no greater concerns than their own. It was raining outside, just a light drizzle, but enough to bring a chill upon the day. There were high windows in the fourth-floor chamber where the Council's directors met, but they were tightly closed and locked. There were things that could fly, of course, and things that could scale stone walls with bare feet and hands. All of them had ears, and, in this room, the Council would not allow its wishes to be overheard. The room covered most of the fourth floor. Comfortable leather chairs and small side tables were in the corners closest to the windows. The directors might retreat there in pairs or trios to have a sherry and a smoke, or perhaps tea. But the business was done around the mahogany table on the other side of the room. There were 14 chairs around the table. At the moment, only 9 of them were taken. 7 by council directors, 1 for Yenna herself, and a 9th by the Slayer. For her part, Sophie sat quite respectfully and answered the questions posed to her. Harold Travers sat at the head of the table. For the purposes of this meeting, and several others they had attended since their arrival, Mr. Travers spoke for the council.
"You're certain?"
Mr. Travers inquired again, almost impishly pleaded with his question.
"In the past week, not a single vampire?"
None, Sophie replied. She had been required to learn English when she had first begun her training. A product of the arrogance of the council, Yenna thought. They were based in Britain, and so the Slayer must be able to speak English. 2 minor demons only, Sophie added, her accent thick. She had not been practicing her English much. Yenna studied Mr. Travers as he glanced around at the other directors gathered at the table. Several of them nodded meaningfully. One, a bespectacled, gray-haired woman Yenna did not recognize, leaned over and whispered in Travers' ear. With a puff of his chest, Travers straightened his tie and sat up in his chair.
"I had hoped that we could put off this discussion until Mrs. Giles returned from her research in South America. But with the war on, we cannot know for certain when that might be," Mr. Travers explained.
Yenna frowned. What was this about? Sophie shifted uncomfortably, the chair poorly suited to her lanky frame and long legs. Gray light reached across the wood floor as rain pattered on the thick glass. Elsewhere in the building, a door slammed, and then Yenna heard someone laugh. A light, easy sound, a rarity in that building and, in recent days, in that city. Around the table, the watchers sat up expectantly, importantly, and Yenna felt the dread that hovered over London settle deep within her own heart.
"Our operatives have been investigating this phenomenon." Mr. Travers leaned forward in his chair as he spoke, as if to impress upon Yenna and Sophie the weight of his words. "Since the Germans overran Belgium and Holland 8 days ago, and begun their attack on France, the vampires have left Britannia in droves each night."
Left? Yenna asked, startled by this pronouncement. To go where? Travers smiled as if in appreciation of his own cleverness.
"Why, to war, Miss Narvik. To war! What easier prey than the fallen soldier? What better hunting ground than the front lines of a war in which thousands of men are slaughtered every day? Western Europe is a veritable banquet for the fiends. They have gone to war, and the Slayer will follow."
Yenna felt Sophie stiffen beside her, and she reached out and placed a calming hand on the girl's arm. "You're mad," she told Travers, who flinched at the word. "What could you be thinking?" A ripple of dismay, even anger, went through the gathered directors, summed up by the glare Travers gave her now.
"You forget yourself, Miss Narvik," he said, "as you also forget the duties of the Slayer. She is to protect the world from the forces of darkness. That is her calling. That is what she has been chosen for. That does not mean she may sit at home and wait for the darkness to come to her. There may never be a higher concentration of the vampire population in one place, as we will see in France in the next several weeks. Logic dictates—" "Logic be damned!" Yenna shouted. She stood up, unable to contain herself, and glanced down at Sophie. The Slayer's eyes, so cold and blue, were wide and searching as though she were lost. It was an emotion Yenna had never seen on the girl's face before, and she never wanted to see it again. Reasserting control over herself, Yenna took a breath and met the angry gaze of her superiors directly. "Mr. Travers, fellow watchers, I respectfully request that the Slayer be dismissed at this time so that we may speak more freely." "You cannot speak freely in front of the Slayer. She whom you train is your charge and responsibility," demanded the gray-haired woman who had whispered in Travers' ear. Yenna ground her teeth together. "Not in this instance, no." Mr. Travers' gaze ticked once to Sophie, then back to Yenna. "Then this meeting is
I am reluctant to speak in Sophie's presence on this subject because I think it is unkind and unnecessary to discuss a young girl's death in front of her," Yenna snapped. "But if you insist, even if Sophie can find a way to keep herself hidden, how long can that go on? The vampires are a natural enemy, but thousands of soldiers on both sides of this conflict have guns with real bullets. Bullets cannot kill vampires, but they will kill the Slayer. If you send her to war, she will die there."
"You don't know that,"
Travers scoffed. "I do, and so do you," she insisted. Mr. Travers cleared his throat. He reached up and fixed his tie again, smoothing it.
"It is my considered opinion, having conversed with our Miss Cartensen several times, that she is well aware of her duties as a Slayer. Do I speak true, miss?"
Slowly, Sophie turned her eyes to him. She held her chin high, nostrils flaring with both pride and anger. "You do, sir."
"Excellent. I thought so,"
Mr. Travers said, much pleased with himself and with Sophie. He turned to Yenna again.
"You see, Miss Narvik, our Slayer knows her destiny, to find the evil in its lair and root it out. What you seem to forget is that the Council of Watchers and the Slayers who have served us have been at war for centuries. It is nothing new to us if the worst happens, as it very well may. There is certainly no shortage of well-trained candidates in line to be chosen. One Slayer dies, another is called. You leave tonight.
He said this last with a wave of his hand, a dismissive gesture that was a blade in Yenna's heart. You heartless...
Miss Narvik, Travers scowled. One more outburst and you will be relieved of your duties as Watcher. A replacement for you can easily be found as well, though perhaps that is your goal. I wonder if it isn't your own vulnerability to bullets that concerns you here.
Yenna was speechless. She stood gape-mouthed at him, horrified at the mere suggestion. Sophie stood, her chair scraping the floor. Without pause, she walked the length of the table, watchers turning to see her pass, and slapped Harold Travers in the face hard enough that his teeth clacked together, and blood and spill flew from his mouth. No, Sophie, Yenna said, finding her voice at last. But the Slayer was clearly enraged. She had sat and listened to Travers so callously speak about her death without response. No longer.
How dare you, Travers sputtered.
How dare you, Sophie spat at him. You send me to my death. If that is my fate, so be it then. If there are as many vampires there as you say, then it may be worth dying to have a chance at them. But I was chosen, not Yenna. This is my destiny. Her courage is greater than mine because she chooses to go with me. You will apologize. Attempting to regain his composure and his control over the situation, Travers actually managed a sneer.
I'll do no such thing.
Sophie smiled. It was a vicious smile, cruel and gleeful. Yenna had seen it on her face before, but only with demons nearby. The Slayer grabbed Mr. Travers by the tie and hauled him up to his feet. She was taller than he, and he was forced to stand on the tips of his toes to avoid choking. I will go to France, Sophie said calmly, even happily, and I will take a watcher with me. But if you do not apologize to Yenna, then the only way I will go to war is with you as my watcher. She let him go. Travers smoothed his suit and straightened his tie. He ran his hands over his thinning brown hair and cleared his throat.
Right, he said very softly. Sorry.